Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Hanukkah. I am Galia Messika Greenberg, Vice President of the JCRC of Greater Washington. Welcome to today's discussion, Fighting Anti-Israel Terror in the American Courts. We had hoped to gather today amid the light of Hanukkah, but on Sunday, we saw darkness and evil once again impact our community with the horrific terror attack that took place at a Hanukkah celebration in Australia. This terrorist attack underscores the importance of our discussion today, using the legal system and courts to demand accountability and pursue those who finance, support, sponsor, and carry out such unimaginable evil. For those less familiar with the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington, or the JCRC, it is the public affairs and community relations arm of the organized Jewish community in our nation's capital, representing over 100 institutions and synagogues in our region. Our mission is centered on four core pillars: combating anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred, serving as the chief government relations and interfaith arm for local Jewry, supporting and advocating for the State of Israel, and promoting social justice initiatives. Today's program touches on all of these, demonstrating the critical link between advocacy and justice. I want to extend our sincere gratitude to the co-sponsors of this program, the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and AJC, Washington, D.C. Your partnership is, as always, both critical to our work and very much appreciated. For today's program, we are privileged to hear from Aria Portnoy and Emily Elbin, both of Crowell and Mooring. I'd like to briefly introduce them to you. So Aria Portnoy earned his BA, magna cum laude from Columbia University, and his JD from NYU School of Law. We have that in common. And he practiced law for over 25 years. Aria heads Crowell Mooring's hospitality practice and co-chairs its terrorism litigation practice. He has led landmark terrorism cases, securing multi-billion-dollar judgments against state sponsors of terrorism on behalf of victims of major international attacks. As we hear in more detail in a little bit, he is currently representing victims of the October 7 attacks in partnership with the ADL, pursuing Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups and their state sponsors, including Iran, Syria, and North Korea. Aria's work has been instrumental in using litigation and post-litigation efforts to help victims obtain recognition and monetary relief. Emily Albin, over to you. She received a BA, summa cum laude, in international relations from the College of Williams and Mary, and her JD cum laude from Harvard Law School. She has been practicing close to 2 decades and represents foreign and domestic clients in international and transnational matters, with a focus on disputes involving foreign sovereign entities and lawsuits against foreign governments on behalf of victims of terrorism, as we will hear in more detail later. Prior to joining Crowell Mooring, Emily clerked for Justice Nathan Hecht of the Supreme Court of Texas. So before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping notes. Aria and Emily will begin by speaking for approximately 30 minutes to provide an overview of the cases they've been handling and the legal landscapes and the challenges surrounding those cases. Following their presentation, we will move into a moderated discussion and a Q&A session. We encourage your participation through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, which I will be monitoring. Please note that today's session is being recorded, and closed captioning as well as live transcription are available through the Zoom toolbar. So I know both our lawyers in attendance and our non-lawyers who are participating today look forward to a thorough and insightful discussion. And now let's begin. Aria, Emily, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Galia. I'm going to test my technology here and see if I can pull this up. And okay. I'm assuming that's up. Somebody will tell me if it is not. Okay, thanks, Emily. Okay, so thank you, Galia, for that introduction. and it's our privilege to be here with everybody. Hanukkah Sameach, although that's complicated greeting these days for sure. So I'm just going to give an overview of kind of what Emily and I are going to talk about, and we'll look forward to any kind of questions that you have. So we'll start off by just kind of giving a little background, kind of talk about how we got into this work, the stuff that we do, and then just kind of talk a little bit about how these cases work. We'll talk about who can be sued in these cases, who can sue in these cases, how you establish liability. We'll talk about the defendants in the current litigations that we're talking about that we're engaged in right now, specifically on October 7th. We'll talk about how you establish damages. We'll talk about the litigation process. We'll talk about how one collects, anticipating the question that will definitely be asked. So we'll deal with that. And then there's also kind of legislative aspects to the work as well. And then we'll just talk about the October 7th case itself, with all of that by way of background. We're going to do all of that in 30 minutes. So let's start here. Just kind of how we got into this work. I guess I'll say this. So international terrorism, including terrorism against American victims, has been going on for a very long time, certainly ramped up in the early 80s. And there wasn't really a vehicle for victims to use the U.S. courts to pursue justice for cases like this. To try to sue the terrorists was a little bit of a fool's errand. A lot of times they blew themselves up or whatever, and you're not going to be able to accomplish anything anyway. And there's always somebody behind those terrorists, usually state actors, and you couldn't sue those because they had immunity in U.S. courts. In the mid-1990s, there was an amendment to what's called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which is the law that basically says sovereigns are immune except when they're not. And there was an exception that was included in the statute specifically for state-sponsored terrorism. And it's a limited exception. It applies only to countries that are designated as state sponsors by the U.S. State Department on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. But it opened the door to being able to bring these suits without the immunity barrier. There was an attorney at our firm, Stu Neuberger, who was kind of the pioneer of this practice and one of the pioneers of overall of this work. And we have up on the slide here Terry Anderson, which many of you may recall. He was a reporter. He was abducted in Lebanon in 1985. He was held as a hostage until 1991. Unfortunately, just a year ago, he actually passed away. But this was one of the first cases that was brought under this law that Stu brought. We grew up under Stu as our mentor, and we're happy to carry the torch, honored to carry the torch forward of this practice going forward. And so this is just kind of like how we got into the work. We've been doing this work for the past, for me, over 25 years. Emily, I won't date Emily, but not quite that long. And we've represented victims from attacks across the spectrum, including embassy attacks, 83 and 84 in Beirut, just to name a few, 1998, Kenya, Tanzania, embassy bombings, and some more recent attacks, the Nice, France, Bastille Day attack, and obviously October 7th, just to name some of the examples. So that's just a little by way of background of how we kind of got into doing this work in the first place and how we've been doing it for so long. And I'm going to flip it over to Emily, who's going to talk a little bit about who can be sued in cases like this.
So as REA sort of previewed, foreign states are one of the categories of defendants that you can sue. And historically, that has been one of the more productive ways of getting some sort of justice for the attacks that have happened. And so the foreign states that you can sue are the ones that the State Department has designated as being state sponsors of terrorism. So currently, that includes Iran and North Korea and Syria. It has changed over time. Cuba has been on and off there, I think on now. Sudan has been on and off. So those are the states that you can sue. Then there's sort of another bucket of defendants that you can sue that fall under a slightly different law, and those include the terrorist organizations themselves, but then also entities that are supporting or aiding and abetting the terrorist organizations. And so that is a slightly different law than the one that Arya mentioned. That is the Anti-Terrorism Act, which itself has a number of functions. It's one of the U.S. laws that lays out in some detail what are criminal terrorist activities. But then it has a provision that says, oh, and by the way, if you're doing these criminal terrorist activities, your victims can sue you in civil lawsuits and try to get some compensation or some justice. So there's primary liability, which includes something called material support, which is also a standard that gets used against the foreign sovereigns. And then there's secondary liability, where if you are aiding and abetting the terrorist organizations, and you don't have to be a terrorist organization yourself, you can be a defendant in these types of lawsuits. So this is in the news periodically. You'll hear about it. Cryptocurrency companies are often notable defendants because they are, allowing people to do business on their platform and sometimes hiding that they are allowing that or evading regulations and sanctions and so on. And so that is a hook to get them into court. Social media companies, there was a notable Supreme Court case on that. And other entities you will have heard of that do fundraising, entities that are pretending to be, raising money for social causes, but are really funneling it to terrorist groups, that sort of thing. You can go after all of those types of entities in this bucket of other defendants, in addition to just the actual terrorist organizations that are on the ground committing the acts. So those are kind of the two biggest buckets of defendants. And then you have to think about who are the buckets of plaintiffs, who are the type of people who can bring those claims. So Arya is going to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll just mention real quick, just to pick up on what Emily's talking about, if you're talking about suing Iran or Syria, whatever, if you're in the context of October 7th, it doesn't mean that Iranians need to be coming across the fence. It is a material support standard, and that comes in all sorts of various shapes and sizes. But if you are a country that allows or facilitates these types of attacks, then you can be sued under the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act terrorism exception. So let's talk a little bit about who the plaintiffs are who can sue. This is in U.S. court, so there needs to be a U.S. nexus. There has to be a U.S. hook, and I'll use October 7th as an example. So let's say there is an American victim at the Nova Festival, and the direct victim is American. Then that victim can bring a case as an eligible plaintiff, as are each of that individual's immediate family members, whether they are American or not, because it's all based off of the American victim. And it's important to note, talk about this with families a lot, which is the fact it's not like everybody is supporting that victim's claim who was there. It is that each of those family members have they have their own claim because they've suffered their own injury in the loss that has occurred to them as a result of what happened to their loved ones, whether their loved one was killed or taken hostage or even emotionally injured. There is a direct harm to the family member by virtue of what happened to their loved one. A lot of times we'll hear it described as that they've essentially lost, for the ones who survived, thank God, have lost the October 6th version of their family member. So you have victims who are present, and the U.S. hook, as indicated on the slide here, is it includes U.S. nationals, government employees, employees of the U.S. government, and members of the U.S. Armed forces. That is for the cases against the countries. For the cases under the ATA, the Anti-Terrorism Act, as Emily mentioned before, that is more limited. Only U.S. nationals. It doesn't have that same expansion into the family members who are potentially non-U.S. citizens, but family members of U.S. citizens. So it's a little more limited when you're dealing with the private entities. With that, I think I'm going to flip it back to Emily to talk a little bit about how you establish liability in a case like this to ultimately win the case.
Sure. And one other thing that I think I wanted to mention on that previous category is because family members also have their own individual injury, it is the injury to them based on what happened to their loved one. But if you are a U.S. national and you had a family member who was not a U.S. national, but they were present at the event, you may have your own injury and you may be able to bring the claim. Now, it is a little bit odd in that the person who was there and injured but is not a U.S. citizen cannot bring their claim. But that's just kind of the nature of the U.S. nexus. And so it can be an expansive category, and you have to think about those relationships when you're thinking about who can sue.
And Emily,
Um,
I'll just give a specific example of that, just to put something concrete around it. We met with a family. These are people who we represent, and the daughter was at Nova. She is Israeli. She's not American. She does not have a claim, but her father is American. He is an American citizen, and that is exactly the example that Emily is referring to. Whereas the daughter, under this unique circumstance, does not have a claim herself, but her father, as the American citizen, does.
Right. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because it can get very involved and very technical, but this is going back a little bit to Arya's point about what do you have to show to hold the defendant liable. And you don't have to show that the defendant on the other end was the one who was going over the fence, sending people in. So you can show, for instance, that it's Hamas who was leading and directing and carrying out the attack. But Iran is liable because Iran has supported Hamas over the years. And the types of things you're going to show are financial support and resources. They've been funneling money. They've provided training. They've set up, training camps and brought in people from the terrorist organizations who then go out and commit the acts. In the Kenya and Tanzania bombings, for instance, we had evidence that Sudan had set up like a mock embassy with the approach to the embassy in the driveway and was bringing people into that camp to practice the attack, that kind of thing. Providing weapons, obviously, buying weapons and transferring them to terrorist groups, manufacturing weapons for terrorist groups, giving them, training in building their own weapons, providing documents that allow them to travel, giving them residence and safe haven in the country. Those are all sorts of things that can constitute material support. So if you can show that a defendant did that either as a foreign sovereign that's providing material support or as another entity that is aiding and abetting, you can show that they should be liable. And then you just have to show that the support had some relationship to the attack that occurred. It can be a direct relationship. So the example of the setting up the training space that allows you to practice the attack, that's a pretty direct example. So you don't have to show a lot of other support in that. But you can also show that, look, they gave them so much support over the years. They did so many things that it just contributed to their ability to carry out these kinds of attacks. And so Iran did not have to know about this, the October 7th attack before it happened or say things deliberately about supporting that attack, but they've done so much to support these terrorist entities over the years that they just built the capacity for those groups to carry out those attacks, and so they should be liable. So there's a lot of other details, obviously, that go into that, but that is the broad overview of what you have to show to get liability for these types of defendants. And in particular for a foreign state, even though they don't show up in court and argue it, you still have to make that case to a judge before you can get a default judgment because U.S. courts apply certain protections for foreign states that other defendants don't get.
Right. Okay. So let's just put a little meat on the bones on that. Just on this particular case, a lot of questions come up when we talk about this, about the various countries that we have brought actions against here that are being sued in these cases. Iran, there's not a lot of state-sponsored terrorism that goes on in the world that Iran is not connected to in some way. The amount of resources, money, weapons, and the like that Iran provides to terrorist groups, particularly in the Middle East, is staggering. None of these things could happen without Iran's support. So that's kind of the baseline. Syria in this region has had kind of an on and off relationship with particularly the organizations, the terrorist organizations in Gaza. but there is a lot of evidence about Iran's role in facilitating weapons transfers, in providing support, in providing safe haven, and allowing people to use Damascus or other areas in Syria as a base for meetings or trainings or the like. And so that is the role there. And North Korea, which is the one that raises a lot of eyebrows, and I'll just say that we were talking to a victim of an attack, and he was actually at a base, and he was just telling the story, and then he just kind of mentioned that there were these weapons, and they appeared to have North Korean markings on it. We never would have thought about it, frankly. And we just started digging and talking to experts, and you would all be surprised, as we were, about how much information was out there about North Korea's role. North Korea has been supporting anti-Israel terrorism back into the late 60s, early 70s, but there is certainly a lot of evidence that links North Korea to this attack now. And I'll say this, which is that we don't take lightly when we add people to these complaints. We spent a lot of time thinking about whether we were going to add North Korea to this case. We were not going to do it unless we had really good information and really smart people who have studied this, who thought that it made sense to do that. It doesn't mean we're going to win that case against North Korea. We believe we will. We believe that we have the evidence for it, but there was more than enough for us to do it. This is about holding those accountable who sponsored and participated and allowed these things to happen. And so that is why we have brought this case against North Korea. This case will be made through the experts, but we did a lot of work beforehand to make sure that we were comfortable doing that, and we were. This just kind of lays out the different sets of defendants in the cases that we have brought and are preparing, which we've talked about a little bit. With respect to the foreign terrorist organizations, again, a lot of this is about accountability. It's about being in a court of law, stories get fought about and told in various fora. A court of law, we think, is an appropriate place to put on evidence and have a judge say, yes, these things happen, but there is evidence with respect to each of these organizations and each of these defendants that contributed to these attacks. I'm sure we can probably get into a little more of this on Q&A if folks have questions about that. Do want to talk just a little bit about the types of injuries. This is important because, it's a little bit awkward when you do this work. We're very sensitive, especially when you're dealing with attacks that are so raw. We don't go out and solicit and make direct contact with folks. People find out about the work that we do, and we're not the only lawyers who do this, and it's just important that people find people they're comfortable with. But one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that, or might think, well, me or my loved one wasn't killed, wasn't taken hostage, wasn't physically injured, and think then therefore that they're not actually a victim of this attack. The truth is that emotional injuries are very much part of this work. We have represented many, many, many people over the years who were severely emotionally harmed by a terrorist attack. They were present for an attack, did not suffer a physical injury, but were devastated. Their lives were devastated. And I can't say how many times over the years we've had folks come to us and say, oh, I had no idea. And sometimes we'll have the opportunity to bring new cases from other attacks that we had already litigated in courts in that regard. So it's just something that people don't really think about and realize. We just had at my synagogue somebody come and speak from one of the kibbutzim, and just afterwards I just kind of introduced myself. We were just talking, and then as this topic came up, they were surprised by it. They went back to their community, and then people reached out to us and said, we'd like to learn more. And so we were able to have conversations with them in that regard. So just to give a sense of the types of injuries that are involved here and who can be a plaintiff in a case like this. And then the types of damages that can be recovered are there are economic damages, particularly for people who were killed. The lost earnings for their estates. It feels very clinical to talk about it this way, but it is all of this. None of it undoes what happened, but it's really important to the families. We've heard this over the years of how important it is for people to be able to recover and to kind of just move forward, that they have the opportunity to do that. The courts consider all of the suffering that people had gone through, physical and emotional. And then there's punitive damages as well. Punitive damages are much harder to recover at the end of the day. It is part of the case. It is out there as a judgment that could be recovered through enforcement efforts, which we're going to talk about in a bit, but this just kind of gives a little sense of that. So I'm going to flip it back to Emily to talk just a little bit about kind of the process that these cases take, and then we'll take it from there.
So when you start the litigation process, the first thing you have to do in any case is serve the other side. Let them know there is a lawsuit against them and they have the opportunity to show up in court and defend themselves or not. Service can be quite complicated when you're talking about foreign states, and it can take quite some time, which is why we mention it here. Most of the time, it's just a procedural thing that is really easy and is done quickly. When you're trying to serve a foreign state, you have to go through some very complicated steps and you have to work through the State Department, and it can take 12 to 18 months sometimes to just complete the step of serving the sovereign. They almost always then do not show up. And then you just move on to proving liability against them. You still have to, at least in the case of the foreign states, prove it to the satisfaction of the court. So that will almost always involve expert reports and government documents and news reports and, testimony. And you have to get the court to then agree that, yes, the defendant you've put on the other side is one of the ones that should be held liable. And then you have to prove each person's individual damages. This is not like a class action where once you prove liability, everyone gets, a certain amount and you don't have to do anything else. You do individually tell each person's story. And frankly, I think as Arya was alluding to earlier, that is part of the process that I think our clients have tended to find useful and helpful. They have to or get to, depending on the person, tell their story to someone who then has to acknowledge it in some way in a sort of official capacity. So we usually do that through affidavit evidence, so that our clients are usually not appearing in court and testifying on the stand, but telling us their story, and then we write it down and put it in writing and talk to them through it, go over all the details, and then submit that to the court. And again, because we're talking not just the physical injuries or the death piece, we're talking the emotional injuries. It's telling the whole story of everything that happened on the day from when you first found out or when it first happened, through how, the hours of waiting and worrying and trying to figure out what was going on, and the days after, through to, it's now many, many months out, but my life is still affected. I'm still not the same. My loved one is still not the same. And so that is both a privilege and a tough part of our job, is going through those stories with people and hearing all of that, and then in turn telling that story to the court in collaboration with our client. And then after you do all of that, you get a judgment, hopefully, and then you try to take that judgment and do something with it.
I'll talk about that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this. This is the question that everybody has. You've done all this work, and what does that actually do? I'm not going to do them in the order that is on this slide, just because. Well, let's talk about it in kind of reverse order of likely of easiest path. So if you get a judgment, let's say against a sovereign entity, you can go and try to find assets of that sovereign entity. You can go and try to find an Iranian, for example, bank account or a ship, which is in the news now a lot, seizures of ships or a building or the like. And that is a vehicle, and that is something that we look at and pursue. It involves a lot of litigation, could be decades of litigation, but that is certainly one path that can be done. A second thing that has happened, we mentioned how the countries that can be sued here are those that are on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. There have been countries who were on the list and are no longer on the list. For example, Sudan and Libya. We had cases against Sudan and Libya. In the case of Libya, just by one example, one morning, Gaddafi woke up on the other side of the bed and said, I don't like being on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. And he called George Bush Jr. and said, I'd like to make a deal. And they made a deal. Now, when you make deals like that, if they're handled appropriately, the U.S. government will say, well, you have all of these judgment holders against you. You don't just get to pretend that didn't happen. And so that is another way that people obtain compensation. And it has happened. It happened with Sudan and it happened with Libya. The What's at the top here is called the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. And what happened was, after all of these years of having the ability to bring these cases, we mentioned before that happened in the mid-1990s, but for a very long time, it was just a piece of paper. And nobody could do anything with them. And we went, and other folks went, and we were very heavily involved in this in Congress and a lot of lobbying work. And we said, you basically created the opportunity for people to relive the worst days of their lives, and for what? And so we urged and were successful in having Congress create what is now called the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund. At a very quick, given time constraints and high level, I'll just say what it is and what it is not. It is not a taxpayer-funded fund. There is not always money in the fund. In the simplest terms, this fund is funded by cases where companies or the like may do business with a sanctioned actor, may do business with Iran, may do business with Syria, North Korea, or the like. They get caught, they get prosecuted, they make a deal, they pay some massive fines and penalties, and some portion of that goes into this fund, which is then shared pro rata with all of the victims who are in the fund, all judgment holders through the cases we talked about. There's over 20,000 people in the fund at this point, as of today. And that is a vehicle that has provided slow, but real and meaningful compensation to victims. It's a low percentage. It's all done pro rata. So in some years it could have been 5% of their judgments, or 2%, or less than 1%. Unfortunately, in several years it has been 0% because of a variety of reasons, which we're not going to have time to get into on this in this discussion. But what I will say, it has resulted in the need to pursue legislative efforts to make sure that, number one, funds that are supposed to go into the U.S. Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund make it into that fund. Decisions have been made that we think were not the proper decisions by the government, by the Department of Justice, in putting money into the fund. And so there's a lot of lobbying work that we have done to try to make sure that the fund is being handled appropriately. It's hard to get anything done in Congress on a good day. And so those challenges exist, and they're ongoing. And those are ongoing efforts, and always looking for the champions who are going to stand up for the victim community and make sure that this happens. And we'll just keep doing that work for so long as is necessary to make sure that this fund works the way it should work. There will be a distribution. There was a distribution this past year. There will be a distribution next year, but it needs to be more consistent and more significant. There have been times, in fact, where we've even had to kind of litigate, actually litigate against the government to make sure that funds that are supposed to go in, go in. You can imagine how hard that is for American victims sitting there saying, well, first I had to fight the terrorists who destroyed my life, and now I have to fight my government who is not doing what but I think needs to be done to get money into the fund. So this is all part of the work and all part of the battle. We mentioned possible future programs. I mentioned the kind of trickiness of suing kind of the terrorist organizations. There isn't an obvious or a clear path to collecting from those, but certainly there is the possibility of possible programs like have been done with the state sponsors of terrorism with respect to these, what we call FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations. And so it's important to be prepared and have judgments for the victims in that regard. The last thing I just want to kind of get into the case quickly, pushing time a little bit. I'm actually surprised that we actually are where we are within 30 minutes. So I will pat both Emily and myself on the back for doing that. This case, very personal to a lot of us, for sure. There's no competition amongst victims. Nobody wants to be in this club, but certainly was work that we wanted to make ourselves available for, not for us, but because we know that we can do this and we can help victims. We were honored and humbled. The ADL wanted to get involved in a case like this. We know that they went out and interviewed the range of firms who do this work in the space, and they decided that they wanted to work with us. They are co-counsel with us on our October 7th cases. There are 2 cases right now with over 200 victims and family members that are in those cases now. James Pash, head of litigation over at ADL, has been an incredible partner. He was actually just with myself and a team over in Israel, meeting with families and doing interviews. And it's been, the ADL does amazing work, and we're very proud to be working with them on this particular matter that they chose us to be the subject matter experts to work with on this. I'll say very quickly, just in terms of where the case is, it'll tie into all the things we talked about. The service process is almost complete. It's taken a little longer than we had hoped. The government shutdown did not help timing, but that's almost done. We're already working with our experts to build the liability cases against all of the defendants. As I just alluded to, we're already spending time with the families. We were just in Israel. I mean, it's nothing short of excruciating, I will say. Just hearing these stories, they are as bad and 10 times worse than you can imagine. I'll just mention one family. The named plaintiff in our second case is Yonah Brief. He was a medic. His story is amazing. He's nothing short of a hero. He was grievously injured while helping others on the day. He lived for over 400 days and then died of his injuries after untold complications. His story is amazing and inspirational. His parents are amazing people, and it just makes us really want to do the work for them, tell their stories. That is really what's extremely important to these folks. I'll just say, and then I think we're going to open this up and flip it back to Galia for questions. I've heard clients kind of talk about, one client particularly used to talk about how we were his angels, and I always felt a little uncomfortable with that. And the way I kind of reconcile that is that you don't have to be an angel to be someone's angel. I don't know how many people in my life actually call me an angel, but it is important that we are able to do this. And I'll also say that, people comment on the work that we do. I'm sure that everybody on this call, certainly JCRC, ADL, everybody else, I mean, there are so many ways people are helping communities in need, in particular terrorism victims, in particular the October 7th victims. This is just what we do as lawyers. We're just part of the effort. It's a long-term, as I always tell the clients, we don't know what's going to come or when it's going to come. This is a long-term play. We want them to find representatives who they can trust. If that's us or someone else, it doesn't matter. Just somebody who's going to be there for them in the long run. So I hope that wasn't too technical and it was helpful and gives a sense of kind of how all of this looks and works. And with that, and maybe 2 minutes longer than we were allotted, I will see if Galia wants to jump back in and we can field some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for, this presentation. I think, the work you do is incredible and so meaningful. And there's so much, this presentation, I think, highlighted that there's so much that goes into litigating these cases. And there's just all these different facets. So I found it extremely informative. I have a couple questions, and then I'll field some additional questions from the Q&A chat. One of the things you had mentioned now, you'll visit to Israel, which I know you visited Israel many times, I'm sure, in connection with this case and unrelated to this case. But what can you tell us about that visit as far as, meeting with families or actually being, because we can meet these days via Zoom or do those kind of meetings. I mean, what is it about kind of visiting where these atrocities occurred in terms of kind of helping, the case, if it matters, if you can share a little bit about that.
Sure, I'll take that. Emily kind of alluded to this too. I mean, it's really important to us. This is not like, don't get into this space if you don't kind of get what you're doing here. And it's really important to make people feel like they've got somebody in their corner. That is so important. One of the reasons why we went to Israel, and we told the I don't like calling them clients, even other clients, I call them families, but we told them we will come to you. We'll come to your homes. We'll come to, whatever's going to be most comfortable for you, because, we want them to feel and look us in the eye and tell their stories. And it really is really important. It's important to feel the gravity of it. And I'll just give by way of example. We were one of the families we worked with. The victim is an amazing guy. I mean, dating myself, I'll call him a kid, but he's, because he's the age of a couple of my kids, was in the shelter that Hirsch Goldberg Poland was in. The story is, I mean, it's can't even put it into words. And then we were driving down south because we had to go down south and we needed to kind of see it ourselves. And as we're driving down, I realized that's the shelter. And we got out and we went in there, even though we really didn't want to do it, but you had to do it. And, you just have to, you need to really understand. You can't really be somebody's mouthpiece unless you really understand, and you have to really put the time in to understand. And so it's really important to us to kind of make sure everybody realizes we'll do Zoom. That's fine. Some people will want to do Zoom, but we really want people to feel that we're there and we'll make the time for them. And so, and does it help the case? I mean, look, what happened is what happened, and we know, and we'll work with the experts and all. I mean, I suppose, yes. I mean, people will give us pictures, videos. I mean, things that people have. I think it helps because it helps make us work harder and do better.
And it is, I mean, as I think you might have gathered from the presentation, it is a long process, and it's a hard process for victims to go through telling their story again. Sometimes it's helpful for them to just tell their story, sometimes it's not. But you can go through this for a long time and not see anything that validates it or provides compensation for, a couple years, 3 years, whatever. And so to support our clients, our families through that is important to us. It's not just you sign off and then we go away for 3 years and hopefully come back with a piece of paper. It's a relationship.
Yeah, understood. On the liability issue, and you kind of mentioned that briefly now, but as far as evidence, I think October 7th was somewhat unique because it was filmed so broadly. I mean, Hamas actually used that as a way to terrorize, put it on Facebook, reached out to relatives saying, look at, the Facebook. So there's recordings, there's video, there's all these things available. Has that made your job easier, even though it's an awful thing that occurred?
Look, there's no question about Hamas having done these things, right? There's no question about the actors that are on the ground. You can see them; they're there. They film themselves, and so obviously that's part of it, and that does make, if you compare it to, for example, let's say there was an attack, and there have been many cases about attacks in Israel, maybe a stabbing, maybe tragically too many of these incidents, and not as obvious. There's no question here, right? There's no question about who did what was done. There's also more evidence that you'll find in terms of the sponsors, the people who are kind of, backing them up. But, that part is less so in the open space. So certainly with respect to the direct actors, but, we'll use whatever evidence is available, and hopefully that makes it, smoother in terms of establishing the case, for sure.
Right. One of the questions that came in was about, do you use mental health practitioners in order to make the case for damages?
I've been thinking about using mental health practitioners to help our team actually.
And that is another question, actually. How do you support yourself when you're handling these issues?
So the answer, and Emily, you can layer on this if you like, the answer is that we can establish the harm that befalls a victim through their own testimony, through their own statements and the like. Certainly, we can and do use medical records, therapy records and the like. Also, in Israel, Bituach Leumi, Social Security, there's people who have been identified with disability and things like that. And so that all bolsters it. But A lot of times we get this question, people like, I don't have doctor's notes, I don't have this. It's not necessary. It is additive. It tells more of the story from a professional standpoint. So it is definitely part of it, and we use it when it's available. But it's not like you're in a situation where if somebody doesn't have that or didn't seek therapy or whatever it was, that suddenly they're not able to bring their case. Their testimony is evidence. It is sworn. It is part of the case, and so it is a combination of those.
Okay, very good. And we spoke about standing for individuals. One of the questions was, can we use the law strategically for Jewish community rather than individual? So not sure that, how as an organized, maybe an organization, I'm not sure exactly whether you've done more broadly as a group, because you said it's obviously individually based, but I guess it is a thought someone had.
I want to make sure I understand the question, Galia, though. So I'm not sure I'm
So
exactly
bringing a claim on behalf of a group rather than individual.
I see. So Emily mentioned this, right? These cases are not class actions. It's not like, you can say, and we talk about this, we have to make hard calls sometimes too about people who qualify for a case and who's not. And it's really important to us, by the way, not to overshoot in these cases, because we don't want to have any adverse impact on the people who we think will get through in the case. I don't think anybody, I assume no one on this webinar was not impacted, right? Clearly the entire country of Israel was impacted. Clearly the Jewish people were impacted. You'll talk about 9/11, everyone in New York, Americans, everybody. For a lawsuit, for a case like this, which is a unique type of case, which has kind of guardrails around it so that it doesn't spread too much. It is very individual. And so it's just not, these cases are not done that way. They're not class actions. They are individual. And so it's not done on behalf of the community. Kind of what I alluded to before, though. I mean, like, that is the hard work that you do, that JCRC does, that all these organizations do to kind of help the community. But in these cases, it is individual. I think I'm answering the question.
Yes. Okay, one of the other questions, I have a lot of questions coming through, but I guess goes to the evidence and, kind of creating or proving the material support when you're talking about states. One of them is sort of, are you privy to any sort of confidential information or classified information? Can you get that, or how do you address that? So that's the first question on that. And then the other one is, how do you prove, Iranian money flowing? You spoke a little bit about the money flow, and how do you go after that, the trail of money, which obviously, leads to funding these terrorist organizations.
Emily, you want to pick some of that up?
Sure. So we don't have access to anything classified just by virtue of doing this. We can do things like file FOIAs for information and that sort of stuff. And we can try to make contacts in both, the US government and the Israeli government, and to learn what we can. Now, they're not just going to give us classified information, but and we work through experts. And some of those experts are people who used to be in the government, and so they can't give us the classified information, but they can talk about what they learned through their role and why that leads to their opinion as to, what happened and their knowledge of what happened. And as far as tracing the money, a lot of that is done through the experts who talk about, what they learned either in government service or just from studying and researching and writing about this and talking to people, all the ways that people who look into this gather that sort of information. Sometimes there are, more visible things, like, so for example, Binance is a defendant in some cases. And, there's screenshots of like Hamas video or Hezbollah videos seeking donations through the Binance platform, like, send us your Bitcoin here. That kind of stuff will obviously help with information like that. Doesn't tie you to Iran necessarily, but it ties you into Binance for them as a defendant. So it depends on the defendant, and it depends on the nature of what you're looking for, but there's different ways to try to triangulate. And even though we can't access classified information, the US government does put out things that are non-classified that can be very helpful. There's an annual report on terrorism that we can refer to, information like that. So we use all of those sources to create the full case.
There are one or two lawyers out there who think they're the most important people in the world and they should just get whatever they want. We're not looking to do anything that's going to compromise safety, national security, international security of the Jewish people or whatever. So if something's classified, there's a reason why it's classified. But like we do seek out and we do get help. People do want to help us with these cases. But we get information in the forms that we can and usable forms from a whole panoply of sources, as Emily mentioned.
Okay. There was a question here, which I think maybe we didn't mention specifically, but who exactly is being sued in the October 7 case? And I think there were two phases maybe to the litigation where additional defendants were added. So can you speak to that?
Yeah. We had a picture up, but I'll just say very quickly. So and I should say there are other cases. People have gone and they've sued UNRWA. They have sued other organizations. So there's the lawfare is a term that's used a lot now of kind of like, you're fighting through that's the fight through the courts, using the law to kind of combat terrorism, anti-Semitism in this case, or other things. In our cases, the defendants are Iran, Syria, North Korea on the country side. On the organizational side, it is Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and a series of other organizations there. And then there are like I said, you have the Binances of the world, and so these are the entities that are being sued. But there are also other cases that are out there against a whole variety of entities, organizations, and the like. Some of those are brought more to kind of bring pressure to bear, to kind of everything's brought for a variety of different reasons, and different lawyers who are doing things have a different kind of mission. We have a collective mission, but like they're different verticals of kind of of the sorts of things that we are doing. But that's just kind of a rough circle of a non-exclusive list of entities and that are being sued in these cases.
Okay. And with regard to the terrorist organizations themselves, as probably you folks know, there's a couple of main big ones, and then there's a whole bunch of little ones because they split off from each other and they change in weird ways, and the leader of one goes off to form another one. So now you have another chapter. So we've been working with experts to figure out like what are really the key organizations where we know the big names, but where are the ones where we can say, yes, these organizations had people on the ground and they're, worth going after in some sense. And that's an evolving project, but we've picked what we think are the key ones.
And I should say in that regard, there are a lot of times we'll get questions. Well, why are you bothering with? I mean, this is about accountability and a story. So if we think that there's an organization that we have evidentiary basis to believe participated, we're going to tell that story. It's really hard to kind of go and serve and litigate against some of these entities, and that will have its own challenges. There may be barriers that we can't get across, but that's not going to stop us when we think that the story needs to be told, and we're going to work as hard as we can to be able to tell those stories.
I think you touched upon this one, but the question that came in is there any thought to seeking appropriated funds to ensure the consistent availability of funds for the Victims' Compensation Fund?
It's a great question. And the answer is that this is part of our efforts on the Hill, right? I mean, like if the structure that was set up is not good, it's not working well enough, if there isn't enough to kind of help the number I mentioned already, there's already 20,000 plus victims in this fund. That's before a single October 7th victim is in this fund. And so, we think that that's a reasonable thing for people to consider, right? Historically, that was not the case. I mean, it was kind of money that you could kind of like say is somehow connected, but at the end of the day, our focus in our work is to help these families how we can. And if there is an appropriate way to move into that space, these are the conversations we want to have with lawmakers as to what is appropriate and how to do that. At the end of the day, our goal is consistent and meaningful compensation. We don't like to use the word compensation. I like to use the word relief for the victims, and all of that. I don't take anything off the table in terms of considering it, and those are the conversations that we have to have. What we need people in our government on Capitol Hill that want to pick up the flag and help and make sure that this community of victims, how this community of victims can be helped. It is a lifelong. It doesn't end we have victims from attacks in the early 80s. Their lives continue to be affected. We're now dealing with folks who don't even, who probably are, some of them aren't even in the process of realizing really what happened yet. It is a long-term situation, and so we're going to look for every opportunity to help them.
A few questions came in about pursuing or suing individuals. So either foreign politicians or maybe individuals who were in different organizations moving from one to another. Is that an option under the current statutes?
Not so much under the statutes as we have them. Again, at this stage, everything, everything evolves. At this stage, our focus is on, and you don't see a lot. There are some, I think there was a case involving a businessman who kind of was funding terrorist activity. So you'll see things like that. Not so much on the politician side. In that regard, our focus now is on suing the entities, the countries, and getting the victims into a place of maybe seeing some relief. And then, like I said, our job is to represent these families, and wherever that takes us will take us. But right now, our goal is the shortest path to some kind of relief to help these people put just a couple of pieces of their life back together. If what we're doing is part of the journey for them, then that's what we want to focus on. But we always leave the door open to whatever else can come our way.
On the politician side, you run into a whole different legal challenges of immunity because foreign officials have their own version of immunity, and frankly, the law on that is changing and very unclear, and there's just not really a clear path. And the law is very clear that you can sue the foreign state, so that is generally a better means of getting at anything the state is officially doing, whether it's a politician or the state. For individuals, yes, you can sometimes go after them, but you run into all the same problems you do with the terrorist organizations, and it is somewhat helpful if you're going after a terrorist organization if it has been designated as a terrorist organization. And there are some individuals who meet that bill, but not all of it. So there's, every time you look at different angles like that, there's a different sort of problem you have to figure out.
And this is another thing that came up in the Q&A, but also you touched upon briefly in the slide, is social media and sort of their liability. Is that something you're looking into? Are they involved in any of your lawsuits or other folks who are bringing lawsuits in this field?
The recent Supreme Court case was not very promising in terms of being able to do anything with regard to social media, at least not big companies that just provide general services and maybe don't screen the way they should or something. So to the extent we're going to look at any social media companies, it's going to have to be smaller ones that are knowingly doing more things, are more tied to organizations or entities. And I don't know that is a viable path. But I will say that the Supreme Court case on the Twitter case was relatively recent. So you never know what the effect of a Supreme Court ruling is going to be for several years. So we'll see how it continues to develop.
Okay, there are many more questions coming in, but let me end because I know we're almost at time here with this one question that came up a number of times in the Q&A and makes a lot of sense in this context. Is people want to help, your work, people want to support it. How can folks do that? I mean, if there are lawyers, can they use their legal background, or is they somewhere to donate to support your work, or any other ways that I'm sure you've been approached in the past trying to help with this really, really important work that you guys are doing?
You're not going to see a lot of GoFundMe pages for law firms, so I don't think we're going to do that. The answer is, for me, I'll say, from the legislative side, if folks have, we can always use help, just kind of people have connections in offices and the like for that part of things. If people know people in Israel or in the communities, again, it doesn't have to, there's other lawyers who do this. This is not like the Emily and REA go and send clients our way, but we do want people to know that this is something, if it is part of their journey, or if it can be part of their journey, that there are people who can tell them about it. There's other people in the space who could tell them about it. And so for people who just might not realize, anybody who was in the envelope who was that day. I mean, I can't imagine anybody who wasn't emotionally harmed if they were sitting in their shelter with shooting going on outside their shelter and rockets landing, in their neighborhoods, and the like. So, I mean, I just think that information is power. So people knowing that all this exists, we appreciate when people reach out. There's certainly more outreach than things that we can kind of incorporate into our work, but we're happy to have any conversation with anybody because who knows. Frankly, people have ideas that we haven't thought of, but hopefully this conversation kind of talks through some of the verticals and some of the challenges that we have. And at the end of the day, like I said, it's a long-term play. We really want to be able to have a world where there is nothing undoes what happened. And it's really hard work. But like I said, just Galia, your organization and all the other organizations, this is why we do this. And so frankly, I appreciate the question, whether or not I've got a good answer. But the question tells us that we're doing something right.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Well, with that, we're at time. I really appreciate, you spending the afternoon with us, both Aria and Emily, but also everyone who was on the call. I found this extremely informative. You guys do amazing, incredible work. We're going to continue to monitor and obviously hope for your success and everyone else who's involved in doing this type of work. If you have any questions, follow-ups, feel free to reach out directly to JCRC. I know we didn't reach all the Q&A, but hopefully we were able to respond to many of them. So thank you again, and we'll see you soon.